In the 1960s, a psychologist built a machine designed to create despair. Not metaphorically, literally, it was called the Well of Despair. This experiment permanently changed how science thinks about ethics, suffering, and the limits of psychological research. To understand the well of despair, also known as the pit of despair, it is necessary to understand the scientific climate in which it was created. During the mid-20th century, psychology was undergoing a period of rapid expansion. Behaviorism and learning theory dominated much of academic research, and emotional life was often treated as secondary or difficult to measure. Within this context, emotional attachment was frequently viewed as a learned response, shaped primarily by feeding, reinforcement, and conditioning. It was in direct opposition to this view that Harry Harlow built his career. His name was Harry Frederick Harlow. Harlow was a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and one of the most prominent figures in developmental psychology during the 1950s and 1960s. He received his doctorate from Stanford University and spent most of his academic life conducting research at Wisconsin, where he established one of the leading primate laboratories in the United States. Harlow was particularly interested in the emotional development of infants and the role of early experience in shaping behavior. At the time, the prevailing assumption in psychology was that emotional bonds between infants and caregivers were primarily based on feeding and biological necessity. According to this view, affection, comfort, and emotional warmth were considered secondary and in some cases even harmful to development. Harlow rejected this idea. He believed that emotional attachment itself was a fundamental biological need, independent of food or physical survival. To test this hypothesis, he turned to rhesus macaque monkeys, a species widely used in psychological research because of their complex social behavior and similarities to human development. During the 1950s, Harlow conducted a series of experiments that would later become some of the most cited studies in developmental psychology. Infant monkeys were separated from their biological mothers shortly after birth. Instead, they were raised with artificial surrogate mothers. One surrogate mother was constructed from bare wire and contained a bottle that provided milk. The other surrogate mother was covered in soft terry cloth, but did not provide food. The experimental setup allowed the infant monkeys to choose freely between the two surrogates. The results were consistent across multiple studies. The infant monkeys spent the majority of their time clinging to the cloth-covered surrogate, even when the wire surrogate was the only source of nourishment. When exposed to unfamiliar or frightening stimuli, the monkeys sought comfort from the cloth surrogate rather than the feeding source. Harlow interpreted these findings as evidence that contact comfort, not feeding, was the primary basis of attachment. These experiments directly challenged dominant theories of emotional development and had a major influence on psychology, pediatrics, and child care practices. However, Harlow did not consider this the end of the question. Having demonstrated the importance of attachment, he began to explore what would happen in its complete absence. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, his research shifted toward the study of social deprivation. Harlow designed a range of isolation experiments to examine how the absence of social contact affected emotional and behavioral development. In some studies, infant monkeys were raised in partial isolation with limited visual or auditory contact with other monkeys. In more extreme cases, monkeys were raised in total social isolation without any interaction with mothers or peers. The duration of isolation varied. Some monkeys were isolated for several weeks, others for several months, and some for more than a year. Harlow described the purpose of these experiments in his academic publications as an attempt to understand the origins of emotional disturbance, social dysfunction, and depression-like behavior. It was within this line of research that Harlow created what he himself referred to as the pit of despair. Later, it became more widely known as the well of despair. Despite its name, the device was not symbolic. It was a physical apparatus. The well of despair consisted of a vertical stainless steel chamber with smooth sloping sides that prevented the animal from climbing out. At the bottom was a wire mesh floor that allowed waste to fall through, reducing physical contact with the environment. An infant monkey was placed inside the chamber alone. There was no social contact, no physical comfort, no visual stimulation beyond the walls of the device. The design intentionally eliminated opportunities for exploration, play, or interaction. Monkeys were kept inside the well for periods ranging from several weeks to several months, depending on the experimental condition. Harlow's stated intention was to induce a psychological state comparable to severe depression. The behavioral effects of this isolation were profound and consistently documented. Monkeys subjected to prolonged confinement in the well exhibited extreme withdrawal. They often crouched motionless in the corners of the chamber. Many engaged in repetitive rocking behavior. Some clasped themselves or remained hunched for extended periods of time. When removed from the well and introduced to other monkeys, they frequently avoided contact and failed to engage in normal social behavior. In many cases, these impairments persisted long after the isolation period ended. Some monkeys never developed typical social functioning. Harlow and his colleagues documented these outcomes in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, in later experiments, female monkeys that had experienced extreme social isolation were artificially inseminated as adults. When they gave birth, many failed to exhibit normal maternal behavior. Some ignored their infants entirely. Others responded with inappropriate or aggressive behavior. These findings were used by Harlow to argue that early emotional experience was essential not only for individual development, but also for the ability to form healthy relationships later in life. It is important to be precise about Harlow's stated motivations. He did not present his work as an exercise in cruelty. According to his own writings, Harlow believed that these experiments could help reveal the biological and developmental origins of depression and emotional disorders. At the time, psychiatry lacked reliable animal models for studying severe emotional disturbance. Harlow argued that only extreme experimental conditions could reveal the mechanisms underlying emotional breakdown. From a scientific standpoint, his work reinforced several conclusions. Early social bonds are essential for healthy emotional development. Severe emotional deprivation can produce long-lasting psychological damage. Attachment is not merely a learned response based on feeding, but a fundamental biological need. These conclusions influence psychology, psychiatry, and social policy. They contributed to changes in hospital practices involving infant care and influenced debates about institutional child rearing. Some of Harlow's findings also aligned with later developments in attachment theory, including the work of John Bowlby. However, the methods used to obtain these insights generated intense controversy. Even during the 1960s, many scientists expressed discomfort with the severity of Harlow's experiments. Critics questioned whether the level of suffering inflicted could be ethically justified, regardless of the knowledge gained. Unlike many earlier animal studies, the harm involved was primarily psychological, prolonged, and intentionally produced. As public awareness of these experiments grew, criticism intensified. By the late 1960s and 1970s, concerns about animal welfare were becoming increasingly prominent in scientific and public discourse. Ethical standards for research began to shift. Although Harlow continued to defend his work, it became increasingly difficult to separate its scientific value from its moral implications. The legacy of the well of despair extends beyond the field of psychology. These experiments contributed to the development of modern ethical standards governing research with animals. In the decades that followed, formal ethical review processes became standard practice. Institutional animal care and use committees were established. Psychological suffering became an explicit ethical consideration, not only physical harm. Strict limitations were placed on social isolation experiments. Under contemporary ethical guidelines, experiments like the Well of Despair would not receive approval. Today, Harlow's work is frequently discussed in psychology and ethics courses as an example of why such regulations exist. Modern psychologists generally agree on 2 points. Harry Harlow was correct in emphasizing the importance of emotional attachment for healthy development, but the methods he used to demonstrate this caused severe and unnecessary suffering. The Well of Despair occupies an uncomfortable position in the history of science. It advanced understanding of emotional development, but it also revealed how easily scientific ambition can override ethical restraint. In the end, the Well of Despair stands not as a triumph of discovery, but as a warning, a reminder that scientific progress is not defined only by what we learn, but by the ethical limits we choose to respect. Understanding the mind should never come at the expense of compassion,